Hi friends, this is Angelica. Welcome back to my channel. I was recently contacted by a new dye company and I had a great conversation with the owner. Her name's Sandra and her company's name is Pixi Dust Designs. She asked me if she could send a few dye sets and I said yes. So today we are going to be working with the new Lily dye, and this dye set is part of the May release which came out today. So we're going to start by taking a quick look at the die set. This is a 12-piece die set. There's 6 dies to make a flower, 3 dies for the stem, and 3 word dies in a really pretty font. I'm going to be using Distress Oxide inks to color the white die cuts with. I picked 3 colors for this flower, starting with Aged Mahogany. I'm going to keep my whole inking process on screen so you can see how I color my die cuts. And I do color the majority of my die cuts with Distress Oxide inks, and for several reasons. I love the chalky effect that the oxides give to my die cuts. I also love how easy it is to blend the inks together, and I love the depth you get when you are layering the inks. So for this flower, Aged Mahogany is going to be the darkest color, and then I'm blending that color out a bit with Victorian Velvet. I want the highlight of the flower to be towards the middle, so I will ink those areas of the petals with Tattered Rose, which is the lightest color out of these 3 inks. For the center of the flower, there are 2 pieces. The bottom piece is the pollen pods, which I inked first with my finger sponge that has tea dye ink on it. And then I used a yellow finger sponge to color the pods. Adding brown first just knocks the yellow down a little bit so it's not really bright. And then the second part of the middle piece is the stamen, which I inked with ground espresso. And then I glued the 2 pieces together. I just made sure to put a little bit of glue on those tiny arms, and I dabbed the glue off really quick on scratch paper off screen before I attached it to the pods. I'm going to use glue to attach the pieces together. There is an order to put the lily together. So there's a single petal that's going to be the top layer, and that's going to sit on top of the stamen, and the stamen is going to sit on top of the piece that has the single petal. Well, it has a petal that matches the single petal. So I hope that makes sense. The other 3 petal piece that doesn't match the single petal goes on the base first. Then the second piece, I did keep the glue in the middle on the second piece, and then I glued on the stamen, and then the single petal gets put on top of the stamen. Moving on to the stem, I used Twisted Citron and Forest Moss to ink the stems and leaves with. I didn't bother putting any extra ink onto the Twisted Citron sponge. There was enough on there for me to ink the stem with. I did use Forest Moss on the areas that I wanted to be darker, and I just blended the Forest Moss out with the lighter ink sponge. To assemble the lily, I first glued the 2 leaves onto the stem, and it's pretty self-explanatory where these pieces go. And then I added a line of glue to the top of the stem and just pushed the flower into that glue. And then I set the flower aside to dry. I did make several more flowers off screen, and now we're going to jump right into making a slimline card. I blended Cookie Monster ink around the edges of a slimline panel, and then I did a quick arrangement using the flowers and the words on the panel just to kind of get a quick layout of what I wanted the card to look like. Now, before I added the flowers, I wanted to add just a little bit more color to the background. So my first plan was to do some ink smooshing on this panel, which is why I put a lot of ink down on my craft sheet, but then I was like, I don't think I want to do that, so I just splattered some, and I think this is Peacock Feathers Distress Oxide. I splattered some of that ink onto the panel, and since I still had a lot of ink on the sheet, I just picked out another card panel to smush into that ink, and I'll just use that panel for a future card. For the sentiment, I pulled out some Copic markers. I used R56, R83, RV32, and R81. And I'll explain in just a minute why I used Copic markers here. I scribbled the colors onto white cardstock, and once I had enough ink down, I taped the dies to the cardstock and ran them through my die cut machine. And since these dies are pretty small, I didn't worry about blending the inks out well, like I would have if I was coloring something. I didn't want to waste my inks. There was no reason to. Once the words were die cut, I glued them onto the white words so I had a bit of dimension, and then I'm going to attach them to the card panel. So I did a quick arrangement again with the flowers, and I decided to glue the words at an angle. I liked the way that this looked. Once the words were glued on, I started gluing the flowers around the words, and I did make sure the part of the flowers were hanging off the edge, but the parts that were hanging off the edge were like just the 2-layer parts of the flower, because once you start getting towards the center of the flower, you're getting into 3, 4, 5 layers of paper, which is going to be really hard to cut into. I did keep the stems that I cut off the flowers, and that's what I'm going to use to fill in the empty areas on the card panel. So again, I just kind of did some arrangements first before using the glue to attach the stems to the panel. I'm going to also glue this blue flower, which I did assemble the flower, and then I took it over to my paper trimmer and I trimmed it first. I didn't want to attach it to the panel and then not be able to cut it because there are so many layers to it, but I did want to add one more flower to this panel. So I trimmed it first just to make sure that it would have a clean edge, and then attach that to the panel. I have 2 more leaves to glue onto the panel, and then I'm going to move on to adding some glitter to the sentiment with a shimmer pen. And this is why I used Copic markers instead of Distress Oxide inks to do the ombre effect for the sentiment. When I have found when I brush oxide inks with a shimmer pen, it makes the inks turn really fluorescent, and I did not want that for this card. So I picked out the Copic markers, and the shimmer pen just sits really nicely on top of the Copic colors. So now the words have lots of glitter to them, and I'm going to finish the card with Nouveau Crystal Glaze. I'm going to do a thin layer on top of the words and just set the card aside for an hour so the glaze can dry, and it just gives this beautiful shiny glittery effect, which looks so great next to the really matte flowers. So this finishes my introduction to the new lily die. I will leave a link down in the description box to Pixi Dust Designs shop if you want to head over there and take a look around. You can also find them on Instagram, and I'll leave a link to their page also. I want to thank you so much for joining me. That's all that I have for now. Take care, friends.